So after our last interaction, there was a suggestion. The suggestion was to do away with the filter we were using on the video. Uh, we were using a sepia filter in the second instance and a filter called Stucco in the first instance. So the idea was to filter myself out from the screen, but then there is a request to try and be a bit more visible. So I'm trying that out. This is a kind of an experiment. So there's no guarantee I will continue this long term, but let's try this out, because if you're trying to experiment, the best person to do that is with James Goonewardene, on whom we will discuss today. James Goonewardene takes me back to the preliminary remarks I made on the first instance. Some of the things I said about Goonewardene, that he was perhaps a misread writer, or a writer who has been under evaluated. Secondly, that he died a broken man. These are G. Narasanagam's words. G. Narasanagam speaking to Minoli Salgadu in an interview given in 2007 has said that James Goonewardene died a broken man. Maybe he didn't feel that he got the recognition that he deserved during his lifetime, because as we discussed, out of that first immediate post-independence generation, at least in my assessment, and I think this assessment is something most people can agree with, James Goonewardene was one of the big three who conveyed the Sri Lankan fiction across the decades to the early 1990s. There might be gaps and cavities in this assessment, but along with Punyakanthi Vijayanayaka and to a lesser degree Raja Proctor, James Goonewardene definitely ranks in that first three. Also, Goonewardene, I would say, is pretty much up for grabs, especially in this time and age, with the kind of discussions that are suddenly emerging around us. For instance, to do with climate issues and ecology sensitive discussions. Because if you go back to the very beginning of Goonewardene's career as a writer, and assess a book like A Quiet Place, published in 1968, or The Call of the Kerala, 1972, and then fast forward to his last work, a work like One Mad Bid for Freedom, 1990. Something, both ends of Goonewardene's writing career has in common is an interest in nature, in ecology. And also, you see, we are living in a time where increasingly, at least I find this increasingly in my immediate circles, there are people who are more readily trying to break away or turn away from the hectic rat race in metropolitan consumerist lives, because you see, there's a model that we are ingrained young to move ahead in life, to accumulate things in a material consumer sense, a life which is preoccupied with mobility all the time, upward mobility. So to get a kind of a comfortable, lucrative job somewhere in a metropolitan hub, and then to carry on. This has been the kind of the repeated, detested but repeated and relished formula of urban living. And if you take life as a whole, that movement from the margin to the center, it's almost at the heart of capitalism. But increasingly, as I said, I find more and more people who are now ready, people who are even quite successful professionally, who are actually thinking of kind of reversing or resetting this trajectory and to move from the center to the periphery. I know quite a few people who are at least thinking about this consistently. all the time, and their dream in life is to actually leave the city to the margins, to the periphery. Um, so definitely that kind of this is the catchphrase we hear the last 5 to 10 years. The phrase we hear is that we need a system overhaul, a kind of a system change. So what you mean by system here is actually the life rhythm you have subscribed to, right? And how you do how you get about things. Now, Gunawardene interestingly proposes both. Number one, a break away from the city, and number two, to drop a gear or two in how you live your life as early as 1968 in a quiet place, and then once again in The Call of the Kerala in 1972, and also in some of the short stories included in his 1976 collection, The Awakening of Dr. Kirti. Of that collection, The Awakening of Dr. Kirti, the title story is what predominates, but other than that, there are several other stories that kind of connect with rural agriculture and the kind of life that is centered around that. So these are things Gunawardene has suggested long ago, about 50, 60 years ago. And for that, for suggesting these, the reward he got from scholars and critics alike is the label of being a romanticist, right? So he was called a romanticist. He has been called someone who is escapist, someone who shows escapist tendencies and preoccupies himself in sketching rural, idyllic, exotic landscapes. Now, I'm myself guilty of this, splatting Gunawardene with this assessment, largely because of blindly following scholarship that has been pushed down to me. But at least I would say better late than never, because later I would kind of position myself to reassess some of these statements, some of these conclusions. Now, there are 2 points which you can enter the discussion from in unseeming some of these conclusions that have kept Gunawardene down, made him a broken man, according to Jean Arsenaiga. One point is what I have already suggested, the kind of emergent discourses of our time to do with climate, for example, minimalism, if you call it that. Now, for a long time, I would say the Sri Lankan Academy has been urged, or the Sri Lankan Academy has been compelled to take refuge in social and political axes in dissecting, in investigating literary texts. So I think this is something which is not a fault of the academy, I would say, because that is the kind of inheritance we had post independence uh, from the 1950s onwards. Social upheaval, social change, nationalism, and then we had segregation of the nation state, the emergence of political dissent in terms of, it could be class politics, it could be grassroots mobilization, it could be political movements along ethno-nationalist lines. Then we had the 1980s, a decade rife with socio-political turbulence. So some of the discussions that have emerged from these historical political junctures have provided the frameworks and the kind of the kind of overall discussion platforms to carry out literary analysis. So it's not a problem of the academy. It's by itself. It's who we are. It's the kind of environment into which post-independence Sri Lankan literature was channeled. So maybe because of that, aspects such as nature-related, climate-related things were pushed into the margins within that overarching dominant discourse. So that is one point of entry into kind of retaking Gunawardena. Uh, the second point, of course, is to place Gunawardena adjacent to or side by side with some of his contemporaries writing in the Sinhalese language at that time. And about 4 years ago, I actually wrote a paper on this subject, most probably the only kind of worthy paper I have written. I don't write much papers, I've only written three or four. This is one of them, where I try to reconsider Gunawardana's position, not insulated within the Sri Lankan English literary canon, but in comparison to what was happening in the Sinhalese literary field around the time. So for my convenience, I always draw on these two examples, uh, K. Jayatilaka and Mahagamasekara, two dominant figures of the 1960s going into the early 1970s. Now, if you take K. Jayatilaka's writing, for instance, especially his early writing, leading up to, I would say, 1980, where, in my humble opinion, Jayatilaka should have stopped writing in 1980, where he publishes a novel called Rajapaksha Walauva, nothing to do with our Honorable Prime Minister, but with Rajapaksha Walauva, he should have stopped writing because Jayatilaka's downward spiral begins there. And most probably, our overall assessment of Jayatilaka as a literary figure would have been very different had he stopped in 1980. But definitely in the 1960s, novels like Charita Tunak, for example, and then the kind of literature that is seamed through work like Pitamaha, Kale Ayante. Pitamaha and Kale Ayante very often complement each other, and there are some threads that are even that can even be said to be continuations where those two novels are concerned. But definitely works like that, Kale Ayante, Pitamaha, Charita Tunak, they seem to suggest a universe which is seeped in traditional countryside village values, which are self-sufficient and set apart as alternative spaces to whatever the metropolis has to offer. So this is so if you take Pitamaha and Kalyante, mid 1960s, Gunawardene is writing around the same time. A Quiet Place is published in 1968. So I think that kind of comparative lens will actually help us to unpack some of these things we have been loading Gunawardena with. Then, of course, you have Mahagamasekara. Even when Sekara centers his poetry within the urban, the metropolis, there's that very interesting centrifugal force within the poetry, always urging you to move away from that metropolis. In other words, the poetry, by and large, kind of dissects the underbelly of metropolitan life, focusing on the detritus that emerges from it. So that is Gunawardena Reconsidered, where I am, where I stand. Now, people like Gunawardena are important, I would say, because unlike some of the literature that later emerged to take the global stage by storm, right? Literature which kind of carries the Sri Lankan insignia. People like Gunawardena tend to table an energy that is socially and politically quite aware. So that social political consciousness is at another level compared to some of the writers who are spatio-temporally, in terms of space and time, away from Sri Lanka, dislocated from Sri Lanka, but still writing about Sri Lanka. So this is there in Gunawardana's writing. But the problem, I would say, is Gunawardana is not particularly a very good storyteller. So I think that's his problem. There are times where Gunawardana can be quite boring to read at a stretch. So it's a bit like me writing a novel, right? Gunawardana, boring, and sometimes he could have benefited from a better editor, maybe, right? So he's definitely not the best storyteller, but he has a sensibility, a consciousness, and a kind of approach to life which can definitely go far in a literature classroom. The concern for nature and ecology kind of stands out definitely. And I would say, compared to Gunawardana, definitely Punyakanti Vijayanayaka, for her ability to tell the story or the ability to create narrative, she definitely scores a better bid than Gunawardana. But then I don't think that kind of absolutist analysis should be encouraged at this point.